As a professional armchair psychologist, I've always found true crime cases involving madness or insanity fascinating. It's one thing to wonder what could possibly drive someone to murder anybody, but it's another thing altogether when someone rips someone else's eyes out in a fit of insanity. All horrific, yes, but on Like a Moth, we just can't help but find the more disturbing cases all the more interesting. And today we're discussing the story of two sisters who, alongside allegations of an incestuous relationship, were overtaken by madness. At least that's what they claim. This is the story of the Papin Sisters. It was dark, and rain was drowning out the town of Le Mans. The streets were cold and empty, save for the men gathered outside of the two-story townhouse on number 6 Rue Briere Street. Two of the men hung back, hunched against the rain, while the others knocked on the door. Their knocks grew louder and more insistent, but nothing responded from the other side. Without any other options, the door was kicked open. Inside the Lancelin estate, it was pitch black and eerily silent. One of the men, hovering in the door, mentioned that his housekeeper should be home and it was odd not to see them. The men at the lead crept further into the dark space, scanning for any signs of movement. They slowly began up the stairs, when one of the men paused. He nudged his colleague gently, trying not to alert anybody else, and pointed. The other man followed his gesture as best as he could in the dim landing, and suddenly he felt bile rising up in his throat. He quickly clapped a hand over his mouth to keep from making a guttural noise at what he saw, and his partner readied his baton. Forcing himself to maintain his composure, the man gripped his baton as well. He stared long and hard at the bloodied, severed eyeball laying in front of them, and with a silent signal to his teammate, continued into the chillingly quiet second floor. What the men would have to face as they ventured deeper into the house would rock the town of Le Mans for decades to come, and forever tear apart the lives of two sisters. This is the story of the Maids of the Lancelin house. In 1905, Clemence and Gustave Papin introduced baby Christine to the world. She was their second child, and in what should have been a celebration was dull despondency. Neither parent cared for the birth of their new child, and that would be a running theme for the children of the Papin family. Clemence was severely depressed by this point in her turbulent marriage, and Gustave enjoyed a bottle of spirits more than dealing with his family. As a result, Christine was sent to live with her aunt not long after her birth. At age 7, she was sent to continue her upbringing in a Catholic orphanage, just like her older sister had been before her. Finally, Leo was born in 1911, marking the last member to join the Papin family. Unfortunately, conditions in the household hadn't improved by the time Leo was born, and she struggled to find a place in her home. She grew up meek, nervous, and was notably unintelligent for a girl her age, trying to be little more than a shadow around her parents' chaotic relationship. Eventually, like all of the Papin children, Leia was sent off to live with a family member. When the sisters did spend any time with their parents, it was a horrific experience for the young girls. Their parents would get into loud, violent arguments, and the girls experienced attempted assault and abuse. With their eldest sister, Amelia, having gone to stay at a nunnery, Christine and Leah grew up incredibly close, finding comfort in each other when they couldn't find it elsewhere. Eventually, their parents called for a divorce, which was reported to have been spurred on by Clemence's jealousy of how much attention Gustave gave his daughters over her, even though his advances were not reciprocated and were more than just familial love. The girls were in desperate need of stability, and in 1925, they would finally catch a lucky break. They were accepted for a dream position for poor working-class girls of their time. They would become domestic servants of a wealthy family in Le Mans. The girls would be given stable shelter, they would be fed, clothed, and even paid for their time. And most importantly, they would be able to work together in the estate. Not knowing what exactly the future had in store for them, the girls knew their lives were about to change drastically as they began their employment. Life was relatively unspectacular inside of the Lancelin home. The girls shared a small room on the second floor and spent their days working on the house for the family. Christine was a particularly good cook and would often be responsible for the meals the family ate, and both girls worked long hours every day cleaning the home top to bottom. As far as the public was concerned, the girls moving into the Lancelin home was a dream come true. They were quiet, obedient, and hardworking staff. The girls were a little peculiar, choosing to only spend time together, but for the value of obedient housemakers, no one saw it as anything noteworthy. They were also treated quite well for their status and position, according to outside perception. They had a heated, private room and were paid a standard wage for their role of the time period. While neighbors in the community saw the new arrangements as ideal for everyone, things inside the house told a different story. Christine and Leah were employed by Renee Lancelin, a retired lawyer who was head of the family. Neither girl could say much about Renee, as in the 7 years they worked there, they had never once spoken to Renee. He, instead, had his wife, Lenny, manage the girls. She would be the one to assign them tasks and chores and inspect their work. However, she also didn't communicate with the girls very much. She only ever provided them orders through written directions. The family was rounded off with one more family member, their grown daughter, Genevieve, who had no interaction or interest in the girls, as the class divide was strong between her and them. Not only was the family all but ignoring their workers, Lenny was an incredibly strict mistress. Her standards were high, demanding perfection. She would often slip on a clean white glove and perform spot checks on the furniture to ensure things were sufficiently dusted. If they failed the test, it was back to cleaning. By 1933, the girls had been with the family for nearly 7 years, and in that time, the elitist way the women of the house treated them had begun to slowly rub at a nerve in Christine, one that Leah likely mimicked. The girls were now in their 20s, and the effects of their upbringing lingered over them. Christine was emotionally unpredictable, and harbored a deep resentment that she struggled to name or shake free of. And Leah clung to Christine wholly. She looked to her older sister for guidance and cues on how to behave and think. They'd only grown closer in their time working at the Lancelin estate, but the bond they had formed was about to prove to be deeper than anyone could have imagined. It was a drizzly, overcast day on February 2nd, 1933. Cloak pulled tight around her, Christine hurried inside the repair shop, Leah trailing quietly behind her. Their final errand of the day was to fetch the family's newly repaired iron from the store. Iron in tow, the girls hurried through the misty streets back to the quiet Lancelin townhouse. Renee was at his brother's for the day, and the women of the house were on a shopping trip. Once their shopping was over, they were to join Renee, and the girls would be alone until late in the evening. Excited to be finished with their chores for the day, without the overbearing presence of Lenny, they set about their ironing. However, when they plugged the iron in, it blew a fuse and the house went dark. It had already begun raining out and it was getting late. The girls knew the Lancelins wouldn't be home until late anyway, and they decided they could put off repairing the fuse until the morning. However, not too much later, Lenny and Genevieve strove through the front door, much earlier than expected. They were planning to swing by the house before meeting Renee at his brother's, but they hadn't expected to see neither girl working in the house so dim. The women climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, and were met with more darkness and quiet. Lenny called for the girls, and Christine hurried to her to try to smooth over the situation, as she didn't see it as a big deal. She explained that they had picked up the iron exactly as asked, but when they plugged it in, it blew a fuse, and it made the most sense to wait until the morning to repair it. Expecting her usual cold discontent, Christine was instead met with a fury she hadn't seen in Lenny before. Lenny flew into a violent rage, Christine would later explain. It was her or us. Hundreds of thoughts and emotions hit Christine at once. Fear, an animalistic energy, hatred, frustration, worry. It all hit her as she was suddenly met with the physical anger of her mistress. Whether it was purely out of self-defense or something else, Christine grabbed a pewter jug that sat on the mantel nearby and smashed it over Lenny's head. Suddenly realizing this wasn't as simple as her mother losing her temper, Genevieve tried to aid her mother, throwing herself at Christine. Like a cornered animal on its last legs, Christine was prepared to fight for her life. Leia had been in another room as the altercation began, but she came running at the sounds of the struggle. Seeing her sister in the fray with the two Lancelin women, Leia immediately attacked Lenny in an attempt to help Christine. The two girls began to overpower their victims, and Christine, as was normal for their relationship, took charge. She began to encourage Leia and instructed her to smash her head into the ground and tear her eyes out. Leia didn't stop to think about it or reconsider or even question her sister. Her entire life had been spent following orders, and she'd learned to value the word of her sister above all else. Leia got a good grip on Lenny and drove her to the ground. She straddled the struggling older woman and began tearing at her eyes with her fingers. Christine soon followed, wrestling Genevieve to the ground and violently ripping at her eyes until she could pry them free with her fingers. With both women bloody, exhausted, and now sightless, Christine and Leia knew they were safe. Their victims were entirely helpless now, and the sounds of their screams and cries were gradually getting quieter as the women likely realized how helpless they truly were. This wasn't enough for Christine and Leia, though. Leaving the Lancelin women temporarily, the girls gathered a variety of tools: kitchen utensils, a hammer, and the pewter pot. With guidance and direction from Christine, Leia and her sister would finish the job. First, using the hammer and pewter pot, the girls would beat their victims until they were motionless on the ground. Then, using their tools from the kitchen, the girls would maim their bodies, cutting and stabbing them beyond recognition. A particular focus was placed on cutting up their faces and chests. And finally, in one last act of defiance and malice, they would lift the skirts up on the woman and cut and maim their thighs, buttocks, and genitals. They covered Lenny in her daughter's menstrual blood, and with that, they were finally done. The sisters didn't bother to hide the evidence. They simply cleaned themselves up, locked the doors in the home, went into their room, and got into bed to wait for whatever came next. It was dark, and rain was drowning out the town of Lancelin. The streets were cold and empty, save for the men gathered outside of the 2-story townhouse on number 6 Rue Briere Street. 2 of the men hung back, hunched against the rain, while the others knocked on the door. Their knocks grew louder and more insistent, but nothing responded from the other side. Without any other options, the door was kicked in. Inside the Lancelin estate, it was pitch black and eerily silent. One of the men, Rene, hovering in the door, mentioned that his housekeeper should be home and it was odd not to see them. The policeman at the lead crept further into the dark space, scanning for any signs of movement. They slowly began up the stairs when one of the men paused. He nudged his colleague gently, trying not to alert anybody else, and pointed. The other man followed his gesture as best he could in the dim landing, and suddenly he felt bile rising up in his throat. He quickly clapped a hand over his mouth to keep from making a guttural noise at what he saw, and his partner readied his baton. Forcing himself to maintain his composure, the man gripped his baton as well. He stared long and hard at the bloodied, severed eyeball laying in front of them, and with a silent signal to his teammate, continued into the chillingly quiet second floor. The 2 men would creep further into the second floor, and discover the horrific sight of Lenny and Genevieve Lancelin, covered in blood and horribly disfigured from their wounds, both women missing their eyes. During the investigation, they would discover teeth scattered around the room. One of Genevieve's eyes would be found under her body, and the one they nearly stepped on belonged to her as well. Both of Lenny's eyes would be found in the folds of her neck scarf. Their search would bring them to the room of Christine and Leia, who had been found lying naked in bed together, and would immediately confess to their crimes, which they claimed to be an act of self-defense. The trial for the Papin sisters was notable among the French at the time, sparking a debate on the way their case highlighted issues with class divide. They argued that the girls, raised in a poor, broken family, rebelled against their wealthy masters, with intellectuals of the time holding this crime up as an example of the impending class warfare. This case is also notable, however, for the psychological ramifications it would have, even into the modern day. The Papin Sisters' defense claimed that they had experienced a temporary bout of insanity during the murders. They cited numerous family members who had experienced issues with mental illness as justification for how the girls may be susceptible to mental illness themselves. According to psychological experts, the defense may have been onto something. Some believe the girls suffered from Folie, or shared psychosis. Folie is a rare psychotic disorder in which two intimately related individuals simultaneously share similar or identical delusions. It can even present in larger groups, being aptly named Folie Trois, delusion shared by 3 people, Folie Quatre, delusion shared by 4 people, and so on. Including Folie Familiale, which is where an entire family may share in their delusions. Often, Folie is characterized by a transmission of delusions from a dominant personality, in this case you could consider Christine as an example, to another more subservient person like Leia. Usually the dominant personality has some underlying issues with mental illness, and when those delusions grow, they begin to get taken up by the other part of the shared madness. This is as good a time as any to also mention that it's believed by some that the Papin sisters had a romantic or sexual relationship as well. I couldn't find any official confirmations of that, but if it were the case, it could further explain how Folie may have permeated their deeply intimate relationship. There is also some argument that Christine particularly went after Lenny because they were caught having intimate relations with each other, and fear of altercation spurred on an attack. Despite the defense's arguments of insanity, the court ruled that the girls were sane and would be aptly punished for their crimes. Christine, seen as the lead perpetrator, was sent to be put to death by guillotine, scheduled for September 30th, 1933. Leia, seen as more of an accomplice, received a lighter sentence of 10 years of hard labor. Christine's mental health severely lapsed while in her holding cell awaiting her execution. She suffered from paranoia and hallucinations, and even tried to claw her own eyes out. She was confined to a straitjacket after that, and her sentence was changed to life imprisonment rather than execution. Christine continued to go downhill, however, eventually refusing to eat entirely. She would die of starvation in 1937. Leia was released after 8 years of good behavior. She would go on to live with her mother and take on a quiet, anonymous life under an assumed name. And that is the story of the Papin sisters, the murderous maids of Le Mans. I am definitely planning to find more cases involving Folie to cover, as I find it fascinating. And even though it's something I've always been vaguely aware of, I've never looked into it with this much depth before. I hadn't realized it could occur in larger groups, so here's hoping I'll be back with a Folie Familiale story next. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. If you enjoyed this video, liking or subscribing really means the world to small channels like mine. And remember, we cover some of humanity's absolute worst on this channel, and it's eye-opening to see how much bad there is out there. So try to spread some positivity this week where you can, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!